Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Particular Baptist Podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Vincent. You can find us and other podcasts at reformpodcast.com. Also, check out our blog at theparticularbaptist.net, in which we just released an article on the Matthew Barrett situation. And I want to briefly discuss that before we dive into our topic today. Um, but yeah, go check out our blog, theparticularbaptist.net. One of our contributors and team members, Andrew Warwick, posted an article yesterday on that, in more specifically an aspect of Barrett's discussion on him leaving the SBC, leaving Baptist theology, and going to an Anglican persuasion. And Andrew talks about the claim that Barrett made that Baptist hermeneutics is individualistic and modern to the core. So he addresses that specifically and discusses some of the other things surrounding Barrett's leaving. But I want to give some of my own thoughts here briefly. It definitely was a shock to me, if that's even the right word to use. Maybe surprising is a better term to use. I was surprised to see that Barrett had left Baptist theology, left the SBC, and went to an Anglican persuasion. I'm not sure what aspect of Anglicanism he went to. Maybe it's the North American version of it in terms of the denominational or classical. I don't know. I haven't looked deeply into that. I do know the seminary he goes to, I think it's Trinity Anglican Seminary, I believe it is. It's definitely a more progressive seminary. They train female ministers and seem to have an appetite for egalitarianism. So there's definitely some liberal threads there to some extent, at least, which maybe is not completely surprising to me considering where Barrett was coming from in the SBC, but it's still disappointing to see that. I want to talk just briefly some of the things that he talked about. He put out an article. He sent out an email. I think it was because I was subscribed to his Substack that I got the notification for it. But he has an article in his Substack. His blog post blog is called Anselm House, and it's called "I Am Leaving the SBC and Becoming Anglican." This is from July 24th, and he talks about why he left. And there's some interesting points he brings out here. He says that the first pillar, he says, quote, "The first pillar started to crack a year ago when a group of Southern Baptists stood before the SBC asking for the inclusion of the Nicene Creed in the Baptist faith and message. I applaud these men, but the responses said everything from no creed but the Bible to it's not good timing to every other excuse in the book. When the resolution was presented for the executive committee, months later, the committee officially rejected the creed's inclusion." End quote. This was, he says, is the first pillar that started to crack for him leaving the SBC. And, after reading his discussion about the creed and the disappointment he had surrounding the rejection of it in the Baptist faith and message, I can sympathize with that. I can even applaud his disappointment on that, because you do see this pushback, unfortunately, in the SBC against orthodoxy. And I'm not saying that everybody in the SBC rejects the Nicene Creed, but clearly at an institutional level, there is pushback against that creedal basis, that creedal understanding of the church's history and the importance of having orthodox creeds integrated in your statements of faith in some way, shape, or form. It doesn't have to be that you don't have to include the creed in those things, but you do see. But the reasons he's giving here, it's not right timing. It's no creed but the Bible. There's clearly this suspicion of creedal language in general, and it seems like there is possibly some pushback against the classical doctrine of God. Now, I want to be careful because maybe there are those in on that committee who do believe in a classical doctrine of God who just are not creedal people, which would be weird, but I want to grant grace in that regard. But I just think it highlights some of the theological problems you find in the SBC at a fundamental level, not in line with the Baptist roots where they allegedly came from in the Calvinistic Baptist side, which was very much into creeds and confessions and seeing that as a standard of how, excuse me, of how one summarizes their faith, at least at an ecclesiastical level. So I found that to be an interesting point, and he highlights how the doctrine of eternal functional subordination is still taught in Southern Baptist seminaries, and how this is a problem, and that there needs to be a cleanup in this area as it relates to the doctrine of God in Southern Baptist life. He also talks about church polity some. He does talk about how the SBC is consumed with its image rather than truth. I'm not involved in those things, so I want to be careful what I say and take it with a grain of salt. But I do think there are some evidence there that's true. You do see there is a lot of pushback with the sexual indecency cases that have been brought forth in the SBC and a lot of the political infighting that went on with that. So I think there's definitely some of that there. And he talks about ecclesiology too, and how there needs to be this episcopal model, like that's modeled in Acts 15, and how allegedly the church jumped to this model quickly after the apostles died. And it's funny, I was actually talking to Andrew Warwick today, the one who wrote our latest article, and talking to him about how you're talking about this understanding of that the early church has kind of bounced to episcopacy in terms of its church government. And I pointed out to him how Cyprian, an early church, very early church father, advocated for local bishops as opposed to some sort of hierarchical bishop over all of them. He was very much into teaching the unity of the body, but he was also careful to point out that bishops need to have their own local authority. Bishops were really just seen as elders, right? And you usually had a plurality of them in the local churches. This is in line with Paul's thinking in establishing an eldership. Not that you have to have a plurality of elders, but the point being that there is that office of elder for a local assembly. And Cyprian was very careful to point out that there needs to be unity among the bishops, but those bishops still need to be focused on their local churches. Yes, I see, honey. Okay. Yes. Okay, go downstairs. One of the risks of having your studio in one of the main parts of the house, your kids walk in. But he talks about episcopacy. And then he says, quote, God took a sledgehammer to the third pillar, baptism. And it's like, oh boy, here we go. Baptism is being brought up as a key issue. I guess no surprise if you're going to the Anglican side. He talks about Acts 2:39 and covenant theology. One thing I found interesting about this, he talks about how he says, I also had to ask myself, was the entire church wrong to baptize the children of believers for a millennium and a half? Was believers' baptism taught by the apostles only to disappear under the supervision of the greatest theologians of the church and then reappear for the first time in the 16th century? And he claims how, his conclusion to this is that yes, or at least considering that this is a possibility, but he seems to lean on the side that infant baptism was the standard practice of the early church, which I think is very hard to point to. I mean, you look at the Didache, for instance, which was a standardized process for getting people into the church. And there's clearly the person had to affirm the teaching that was taught to them in the Didache before they were baptized. So clearly, no infants in mind here. And then you look at someone like Tertullian, who was very much for believers' baptism and criticizes the baptism of young children. He doesn't say infants specifically, but given the principles he's bringing out there, he's contrasting the baptizing young children who don't understand these things, basically saying, like, why would we put such greater responsibility on children who can't do these things for spiritual things, let alone worldly things? We wouldn't put worldly responsibilities that they couldn't handle. So why would we put such great a spiritual responsibility on them by baptizing them as young children? They can't live these things out. He talks about how they are to ask for salvation, right? And he criticizes that view. So clearly this was not some sort of said and done widespread practice that was done in the early church. And I find it interesting that someone at his level of understanding of church history would flake on certain things like that. And then it's interesting that he talks about covenant theology too. One of the things he says, for someone serious about Catholicity, that pill was too big to swallow. Of course, others told me you just have to trust in the progressive covenantal argument. And he's saying, besides its inability to provide holistic answers, its self-conscious departure from Reformed confessionalism, especially around the covenant of grace, proved insufferable. As if Southern Baptists today do not have enough of the proclivity against creeds and confessions. He's right about that they do have a proclivity against that. But it's interesting that he only talks about the progressive covenantal argument, which my understanding is that the 20th century view of covenant theology, which you do find, at least with Waldron, you found early on. I don't know if he holds to that still now, but it's much closer to a Presbyterian covenant theology in the broader Reform understanding of covenant theology than 1689 federalism. But he doesn't even consider that as an option. It's the progressive covenantal argument. Oh, that's not part of Reformed theology, so therefore Baptist covenant theology is trash. And I think this highlights, again, someone who was recently on the forefront of classical theology, recovering classical understandings of God. And I don't know about other things. That was a problem I had. There seemed to be this overemphasis on classical theology to the neglect of everything else that's important too, even though classical theism is certainly an important aspect of our faith and is foundational to our faith. It isn't all that we believe. There are important things that we have to teach as well outside of just the doctrine of God. Covenant theology is an important one too, and it seems like there is this disconnect from classical particular Baptist theology that he probably would be more in line with if he hadn't been a full-blown Southern Baptist. But I think it just highlights the disconnect there in the SBC in terms of the understandings of covenant theology historically among Reformed / particular Baptists, and kind of the roots that you find from the Southern Baptist Convention that are really not taught or not known or just not really seen as important. It's ironic, again, given Barrett's position as someone who sits in an ivory tower. He, I think, should at least have a general understanding of the arguments, but he doesn't seem to acknowledge that's even an option. It's either progressive covenantalism or bust, right? There's no helpful alternative to be able to explain these difficult questions as it relates to covenant theology from his perspective, besides going to a position like Anglicanism. Now, Anglicanism, in the Reformed stream of Anglicanism, I think you're going to find is definitely closer to a particular Baptist understanding of soteriology, God, And worship in general, I want to be very careful about that because Barrett has pictures of himself at his church with icons and pictures of Christ and weird stuff. So, but there is this greater, I think, solemnness as it relates to worship than you're going to find in a general evangelical SBC church, which tends to be more entertainment focused. So if you want to see some kind of silver lining coming out of all this, I think you're going to find that he's probably closer to a particular Baptist tradition in terms of just overall Reformed theology, minus the Baptist distinctives, than what you're going to find in the SBC proper. I think that's something that is interesting to consider. I don't think he's an unbeliever. I think he's a believer. I think that he is struggling through these things, and I think he's might still be able to do a lot of good work in focusing on the fundamentals of the faith. I am concerned about the liberal leanings of the school he's teaching at. Again, I mentioned that they are one of the aspects of what they do is raising up female ministers. I think that's a problem, obviously, and I think that and if he's teaching in that environment, he is advocating for that. So there's definitely liberalism that is coming out in his transition. It's probably always been there, and this is just now he can live out his convictions. I think that's probably what we're going to find here. But I've benefited a lot from Barrett, from Credo magazine, which doesn't appear to be going away. The Credo, the Credo ministry. I don't think that's going anywhere. It seems like it's still continuing on. Timothy Gatewood is still there, teaching. That brother who we've had on the show before. He's still teaching there and helping to run that operation. But we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens with Brother Barrett. I wish him the best. I am disappointed in that he abandoned Baptist theology as a whole instead of finding that there are good Reformed Baptists who follow in that confessional tradition, who hold to the basics of Reformed theology while maintaining Baptist distinctives and being able to do so consistently. It is disappointing that he jumped ship like that as if there is no other option. He created this false dichotomy. Again, I think that highlights problems within the SBC. They're not teaching their people well on their own traditions, covenant theology, their own traditions, understanding of God, and confessionalism and creedalism, and those things are not emphasized where they should be. And so I think that if you want to kind of get to a sensitive topic like founders, those brothers there, as good as they are, it seems that their mission has failed. This call for them to go back to a classically Baptist, if you will, understanding of the SBC's roots, it seems to be failing. There doesn't seem to be this real desire to grasp, okay, we're going to hold to this. Confessionalism is important. This confession, which we follow in the stream of, or at least did, is the foundation theologically for what we believe, and we need to hold to it, at least substantially. There just doesn't seem and then all the things that come with that, there just doesn't seem to be this traction that's gathering there, and people are falling off the bandwagon, high profile people like this, right? And it just doesn't seem that those good things are happening. I hope it does, at the very least, to get the SBC in the right direction. I think that would be, all things considered, where the SBC is, and as an organization, that would be the best thing. I would be okay if the SBC went away. I don't think we need it. I think churches have survived thousands of years without it and will survive without it if it goes away, if they are grounded biblically and confessionally. So, you just kind of work with what you have, I guess. But anyways, those are some of my thoughts on Barrett's departure. wish him the best, and I hope he continues to put out a lot of good work. Again, I've benefited from him, especially on the I've benefited from on the doctrine of God and recovering classical theology. I think there's a lot of good that came out of his work at MBTS and things like that. So and it seems like he's still going to push into that vein of recovering classical theology. Just I think we'll just have to kind of read things more critically now that given his theological persuasions, but I don't see why the fundamentals of the faith won't be there that we can agree on and benefit from. So hopefully there's still a lot of good that comes out of that. Anyways, you can look at the article. He wrote a long thing too on the beauty of Anglicanism and talking about why he likes Anglicanism. So you can read that for yourself. Okay. So now to our actual topic today. I went on for about 20 minutes on that. And let's see if we can transition a little bit here. So for our topic today on talking about the kingly, related to the kingly office of Christ, this was an episode we did, I don't know, a month or two ago, maybe a couple months ago, on the offices or on the kingly office of Christ. But I ended up teaching about it at our church in adult Sunday school. So I expanded my episode notes and scope, I guess, to make it long enough and in depth enough for an actual Sunday school lesson. But one thing that came out of that I thought was very interesting, a brother who was in the audience, I had raised comments or questions after, and he brought up a good point about how even though Christ is king, we are still adopted children of that king. And I mean, obviously I believe that, but as I was teaching this, I hadn't thought about it like that. I was so focused on the office itself and what is Christ's role in all of this, and what is the natural kingdom of Christ versus the economic kingdom of Christ. But I hadn't considered it, as I was teaching at least, how is our relation to the king himself. And I do talk about implications of the kingly office of Christ for the Christian, but there is a sense where we are actually not just subjects of this king. We are taken as slaves of unrighteousness, and then we are brought into the kingdom of Christ as adopted children, and we are slaves to Christ, but it's not a slavery of burden, it's a slavery of joy and freedom. And that's the irony about being in the economic kingdom of Christ, the economic kingdom being Christ's kingdom over his church, and specifically about salvation and the work that comes through that. It's like a special administration of his kingdom. Christ doesn't have two kingdoms. It's not like he has an earthly kingdom or a natural kingdom that's distinct from his economic kingdom. These kingdoms are this it's the same kingdom considered in a twofold way. So talking about his economic kingdom, we're talking about his ruling over his church, salvation, etc. But as we are translated as being slaves of unrighteousness to slaves of righteousness, that slavery is not a burdensome slavery. It's not a slavery of tyranny in the sense that we're cowering in fear of our King Christ, that we are trying to slip around the rules as much as possible that the king sets down. No, we want to be in this kingdom. We've been changed so that we desire the things of God and we want to obey God, but now we don't find slavery a burden in Christ. We're free, right? For freedom, Christ has set us free. So stand firm, therefore, in your freedom, right? As Paul talks about in Galatians, that we are to be living as free people. But the irony is that we are still subjects of another king. You're either the subject of king of Satan, who the kingdom of darkness, who enslaves its subjects in unrighteousness, or we're slaves of righteousness in the kingdom of Christ, but we are now children of that king. So not only do we serve Christ with joy, we have First John 5:3, for this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome. So the commandments of Christ are not a burden to us as Christians. We want to obey our king. We have joy in obeying our king. That doesn't mean we're perfect in that arena, but this is the trajectory of the Christian. This is his general life. He keeps his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome, but we are part of the family of Christ as well. Not only is he king over us, but we sit at his table. And if you know anything about a king's table, that is a very special place to be. You're eating with the most powerful man in the country, maybe even in the world. You're eating at his table, where he sits down and nourishes himself and talks with, maybe if he has a family, talks with his family, confines in his advisors, maybe. But to be at the king's table is to be close to the king in a way that nobody else has. So we eat at the king's table as not just as important subjects and elevated subjects and in noble positions. Not even that. We're part of his family. So we always get to sit at the table by right because of what the king did, because of Christ's work on our behalf. We are adopted into the family of God. So he rules over us with his law, but he also treats us as family, not as a harsh king, right? Over his people. And that's what Jesus said, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. So it's not a taskmaster ruling. It is a fatherly type ruling over us. And that should make us joyful. It should bring a lot of peace to us, even as Christians. Last week I was, again, talking with Andrew. Andrew and I are always talking about theological stuff. He is my brother-in-law, too, so that, I think, contributes to it. But we talk all the time throughout the week, sometimes on Sundays after Sunday school or church. We're always talking about theology. But, we were talking about this principle, and it does bring such a joy and rejuvenation to know that we pitiful worms and wretches have been brought into the family of the King of the universe. I mean, that should bring us great joy. It should push us to obedience and love and praise of our King, that we can do this, that this is now our reality, and we will judge the world, as the scripture says, and we're co-heirs with Christ, right? I mean, very personal language and putting us in very high positions that only the nobles, kings could ever claim to, depending on what position they were in. So for us as Christians, it is a joy that because of what Christ did, we have these positions. We can sit next to the king. We're not just servants of the king who he forgets about as soon as you leave. And the only reason you're not dead is because you just happen to do what he wanted you to do that day. But instead, it's, I rule you, yes, I am king, but you're my family, and I love you, and I treat you as a son, treat you as a daughter, and bring you into the palace to live and to serve with joy because of what he's done. So, after Sunday, or after teaching this lesson on Sunday on the kingship of Christ, that was very encouraging to me to consider those things. And sometimes, I've been at this church for 20 years, over 20 years at this point, most of a good portion of my life. And sometimes, you hear these truths, you hear about Christ as king, the offices of Christ all the time, right? And you hear that you're adopted, you're part of the family of God. But sometimes those doctrines don't always click inside of our minds. They don't always go hand in hand right away. You don't put the pieces together, and then you're going through this, or you hear someone else talk, and it just clicks, and it's like, whoa, that is really, really neat. It's really neat to see God's word come together, and it encourages us, and it should. And that's the means of grace working. You're teaching the word, you're being edified by fellowship from other brothers, you're talking through these things, and it brings encouragement and joy to our hearts. And that's one of the things I love about the Lord's Day, is being able to fellowship and discuss these theological truths with other brethren, because it does encourage. I'm encouraging them, they're encouraging me. It helps us to push along in the Christian life, and helps us to grow in our faith and our knowledge of Christ. I mean, we are to grow in our knowledge in the unity of Christ, Ephesians 4, right? So that's all part of that process. We're being unified more as we understand the scriptures and the truths of the Word of God, and helping us to become more like Him. And we're in agreement on these things, and we move forward together. So we're becoming more and more unified around these things. And it really is a blessing. But this last Sunday, just putting those things together, Christ is King, but we're also adopted children of God, children of the King. We sit at His table. We live in the palace with the King. That is a joyful thing, and really encouraged me last week, considering those precious truths. And again, I was the one teaching, and I didn't put those things together. And a brother pointed that out as a comment after, in the audience, after I finished my lesson, and it was like, wow, you're right. We are in the family of the King, and it really helps us, I think, bring more worship and joy in the Christian walk as these things are considered. Anyways, just wanted to talk about that a little bit. I hope it's encouraging to you, and I think that lesson was actually posted on our channel. We, at least for Andrew, Sean, and myself, when we do our lessons at our church, we record the audio, or we try to, and then post it to the channel. So go check it out. If it's there, it should be in the Office of Christ as King, in about that topic, and you can hear more of that discussion. But anyways, everyone have a great day and weekend, and Lord's Day tomorrow, and we will be back next week, Lord willing. Take care. Thank you for joining the Particular Baptist Podcast. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at The Particular B, and subscribe to us on YouTube, where you can find more of our podcast content. Also, check out our blog at theparticularbaptist.net. And if you'd like to support our ministry, become a patron today at patreon.com/theparticularbaptist.